Hello, my name is Joe Joyce, and I'm a solutions architect with SmartBear. So I've spent the last 6 years working with enterprise users of our API design and testing tools. And in particular, when it comes to testing, a topic that comes up all the time is regression testing. So I'll always have users asking about what are areas to look at when you're running API regression tests. How do we make sure that when we release an enhancement or new feature to an API, that we're not breaking existing consumers or lining up with their expectations in a different way than we were before this new release? So today I wanted to take a couple of minutes to go through 5 areas to look at when you are regression testing your APIs. So, area number one is status code coverage. It's simple, but we're dealing with APIs. So, we want to make sure that any HTTP status codes that we were handling and returning in our previous version of the API, that we are still covering in the same way in our new version of the API. So, you should always include assertions and checks that are going to look at the status codes that are being returned by your APIs and also comparing what's being returned now with the status codes that were being returned in the previous version of the API. Because I can say from experience talking to developers and users of APIs, there's nothing worse than getting an unexpected response code or something that you didn't have to handle in your previous application, but you now need to be able to handle because of a new release to the API. So keep an eye on those HTTP status codes. Area number two is service level agreements or response times. So how long is it taking your API to respond to a particular request? This type of data is very important to track and keep track of when you're dealing with API testing. How long does it take for a certain request to return a particular response? You should always have some kind of checks in your pipelines or in your tests to look at how long your responses are taking. And if that response time goes over a certain amount of time, you should be flagging that in your regression tests because, again, similar to your status codes, it can be very frustrating when an API response is taking much longer to return than it was when you were using the previous version of it. So service level agreements and response times is area number two to look at. Area number three are security checks. API security is extremely important, as it is with any software development and testing. There's some low-hanging fruit, some simple security checks you can do during a regression test suite execution when it comes to APIs. Things like parameter fuzzing or checking to see how your API is handling particular types of request parameters. So, for example, error handling if there's bad data in an input parameter, or another very common vulnerability would be a database request contained in a request parameter. So SQL query fuzzing. These are things to certainly include in your regression tests because a new feature or functionality might introduce a new security bug. And as we know, they can be very damaging both to your application, to enterprise reputation. So don't forget about security testing when it comes to running your API regression tests. So that's tip number three. Tip number four, I refer to as schema compliance, or it is referred to as schema compliance. You could think of it as contract compliance, API definition, or API design compliance. The idea is that if you're using an API design file for your API development and documentation, so maybe the Open API specification, or maybe you're doing contract testing, so you have contract files for your API consumers that define their expectations. My point here is that if you have these artifacts, you should be using them during your regression tests to make sure that your API's implementation always matches what is described in an API definition or an API specification. They're very useful artifacts to have. You might as well be using them. You should definitely be using them if you're relying on your API designs and definitions to communicate to your consumers what your API functionality is going to be. So be sure and include some kind of check in your regression tests that this new version of your API is still complying with your API spec definition or your API design file, in the same way it was in a previous release. So that's area number 4. Finally, area number 5 that I've observed from dealing with enterprises over the last few years is that you should make it very easy for your developers and teams to seek consumer feedback. And in the same way, you should make it very easy for your API consumers to give you feedback. And that doesn't have to be in a technical sense either. So we don't have to be talking about API contract testing using packed files, for example, even though it's a great way of getting consumer feedback about your APIs. This could be as simple as a Slack channel or support channels, or always actively listening to the feedback from the consumers of your APIs. Because if you released a change to your APIs and that breaks an existing consumer's implementation, they're going to want to tell you about it, and they're probably going to find a way to tell you about it pretty quickly. So this is more of a soft skill than a technical skill, but make sure that those processes are in place and mechanisms are in place so that you can very easily get user feedback, and then it's very easy for your users to give you feedback. And that's going to make your regression testing process something that you can have a lot more confidence in. So we've gone through 5 areas to look at for better API regression testing. Hopefully this has been useful. And if you'd like to learn more about any of these areas or anything API design and testing related, be sure and get in touch over at smartbear.com, or get in touch with your SmartBear account manager, and we'd love to talk to you more about our API hub. Bye for now. Have a good day.